right down the step on the table.
Anybody that still has a book, may need one, there's several. Looks like we're gonna have several left over this time, you never know how many exactly to order. So you got a friend or family or anybody that would like to have one, be glad for you to have one. They don't do any good sitting up there on the stand. Yeah. And as you notice, we're not using them hardly the same way as we have in the past, but I do think that they are good to have at home as you read the commentary and answer those questions in your private study, and that's really, I guess, what they're for anyway, is to allow you to have an opportunity to look at the text and to read it, and hopefully to have some background before we come together. We're, of course, still in the 2 Corinthians. We are ready for chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. And Rick said something about this last Sunday about the different teachers, and I appreciate that as well. And you'll also notice that because there's so much here, you have to pick which way you want to go with that, and that I guess gives some different angles and different thoughts as well as you're studying. Also, one of the things that I think pretty much all of the teachers have made mention of is the fact that we're not studying verse by verse. We're taking basically a section from each chapter, and that allows us to get through the material in order. But that also says that there's so much there for you to study on your own, for you to think about as we work through. And also, particularly I think in this lesson, as maybe in all of them, you have to back up a little bit in order to get the context. And that, I think, reminds us that these letters, when they were written, were not in chapters and verses. Hundreds of years later, that took place. Most of us haven't known anything different. And it is helpful to be able to know which section you're talking about by mentioning chapter and verse. But you have in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, it starts with the little word for. Well, sometimes it says therefore, sometimes it says since this has happened, or it may even start with the word but. And there may be some other words. And when you see those words, you know that it is connected to what he had just been talking about. So in this particular chapter, it goes back to verse 7 of chapter 4, and it's interesting that that verse also starts with the little word but. It says, but we have this treasure, talking about the gospel, in earthen vessels, talking about us, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. And Rick talked about that last week in reference to the gospel and the parable of the treasures. I know he went back and mentioned that as well, the pearl of great price, talking about how valuable it is to have that which offers salvation, to have the gospel, to have the truth, and the fact that it's humbling, but it's also very challenging to know that we are responsible for having that treasure, for protecting it, for keeping it, and for offering it to our neighbors and friends, teaching our children, teaching our grandchildren about this wonderful message. And there's always been dark times in the world, and I think a lot of the things that are going on in our country, and there are a lot of countries that are much worse positioned than we are. we need hope. We need to be able to see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And that light, of course, is heaven. That is pointing us towards that place where there will be no doubts, no fears, no persecution, no politics. Aren't you thankful for that? So on and on it goes. And we look at ourselves and we think, it's bad. But when you think about Corinth, Corinth was filled with fornication, idolatry, worship to false gods, and it just goes on and on of the problems that these particular people had. And in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul is just going back and trying to answer some of these questions. So, that said, this particular text is truly a test of salvation and what that means, and it offers us hope. I mentioned, verse 7 of chapter 4, but if you look down to verse 16, therefore, we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. And I think really that's what the first 11 verses of the next chapter are all about. So, as you think about that, what Paul is going to do in verses 1 through 10 is to answer that question or that thought in verse 16. Do not lose heart, or do not faint not. Maybe is what your particular translation is saying. And he's going to talk about what he refers to in verse 17 of chapter 4 as the eternal weight of glory. He's going to explain what he means about that. And he is going to set forth the difference between that which is visible and that which is temporal. We walk by faith, not by sight. And if you look on down in verse 7 of this particular chapter, chapter 5, you'll note that point. So Paul is going to talk about his longing for heaven, his desire for something better, to get out of this old body, or this tent, as he calls it, and yet at the same time express his concern for the people and the responsibility that he has to continue to preach and teach, so that not only does he have this hope of heaven, hope of something better, hope of a body, that is not wearing out, and he recognizes the privilege and the honor and the responsibility of preaching and teaching. He's going to use a lot of contrast here. He's going to talk about affliction versus glory. He talks about that which is light compared to that which is heavy. He is going to talk about that which is for a moment and that which is eternal, that which is seen, that which is not seen, that which is temporary, and that which is eternal. So you see these contrasts, these comparisons all the way through these particular verses. Okay, that's my introduction. Anybody with a thought or comment there on any of that? Okay, I think that what we'll do is, if I look at it correctly, we're going to go more verse by verse here, but I think it'll answer the questions importantly as we come to them. He says in verse 1, for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So Paul is looking for a better body. When you move over to chapter 11 in 1 Corinthians, and you look at the things that Paul had suffered, the stonings, the beatings, the imprisonment, and it just goes on and on. I think that we can appreciate appreciate why Paul was looking for a better body, a better situation. And he also, he starts by saying, for we know, emphasizing the fact that it's not guesswork, it is not, hope so, maybe, but we can know that there is something better, and we also can know if we have it or not. That is not to suggest that there will not always be questions and concerns and things that we maybe don't understand. But you and I can know what we have in store. And we can know that there is something better, and that is not hopefully to, put our nose in the air and act as if, we've got it and nobody else does, or that there's a superiority idea there. But it's simply the fact that Christians can have confidence. Christians can have an assurance. When we go to bed at night, we should be able, to pray and know that if we don't wake up, everything's going to be all right. That God is going to bless us with the promises, if indeed we are living as we ought to live. And I want to make this point because I was fearful that I would not get to it. If you look on down to verse 9 of 1 Corinthians 5, therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to Him. Our aim or our goal. We all know that even when we try our hardest, we mess up. Even when we're, we're saying our prayers and we're studying our Bibles and we assemble together, that there are things that we just don't get to. There's things that we neglect that we should give attention to. There's thoughts that we have, and instead of letting those thoughts pass on through, we dwell upon them when we shouldn't be thinking about certain things. And because of all of just the weakness of the flesh. But here's the difference. What is my aim? Do I aim to do right? Do I aim to be more honest? Do I aim to try to get rid of what might be gossip? Am I working on my anger? Am I working on my jealousy? On and on we can go. But, that's the difference. The difference is, what is my aim? What is my goal? And Paul will state even in himself. He says, what I purpose to do, sometimes I don't do it. And he says, what I say I am not going to do, he says, sometimes I do it. And that was the Apostle Paul. But why could he have this confidence? He could have this confidence because that was not his aim. He was trying, not to do those things. He was trying to do the good things, even though he fell short sometimes. But his aim, his goal. In a way, that's the difference between the saved and the unsaved. And he kind of works towards that, I think, as you look on down through here. Paul, he talks about a tent, he talks about a building, and maybe your translation uses the word tabernacle. A tent or tabernacle is something that a person might live in. When he's talking about this heavenly building, we understand that. John chapter 14, Jesus says, go prepare a place for you. He talks about the mansion. Those are obviously thoughts that Paul does talk about. But here, it is the human body that he's talking about. When he talks about a tent or tabernacle, he's talking about this body, not earthly existence compared, as it were, to something that is heavenly. You know, Peter does the same thing. He mentions being in the tabernacle. That's what the text uses that term in the New King James. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, and in that text, Peter's clearly talking about the body. And even Jesus, you know, when he was here on this earth, he became flesh and he dwelt among us, John chapter 14, or John chapter 1 and verse 14. And literally it's saying that he tabernacled or he tented among us. It is the literal idea there. And we find that in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 5, you know, he has the reference here of the fact that Jesus wore a tent, sort of like ours, body, that was prepared for God for the purpose of his being here. And there's a quote there in Hebrews 10 from Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8. So we know that in this text, he's talking about the fleshly versus the spiritual, this fleshly body versus or contrast to a spiritual body that we will have someday if we live the Christian life. Anybody with a thought there?
In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul had already went over this very well about the differences between the physical and the spiritual. As he says, the celestial body and the terrestrial. And I think starting in about verse 36 throughout the rest of the chapter, he tells them that, and just like Jesus tells us to repent twice in Luke chapter 13, Paul tells them twice, this is the way it is.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Pat. In 1 Corinthians 15, and you could have used a lot of other passages as well.
That's one popped in my mind right there.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that's good. There's just so many, a lot of repetition. Why? It's because as human beings, that's what we need. You know, we take the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Why do we do that? Because we need a constant reminder. It's something that should never get old. Why do we need to be here this morning? Why do we need to assemble regularly, consistently for worship? Even though we may be doing some of the very same things each time, and we may be talking about some of the very same things each time. We need that. And when you look at some of the letters, you look at Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians particularly, a lot of the verses are almost identical as Paul wrote to these different places, and most of those letters seem to have been circulatory. You know, it went to Ephesus, it was addressed to them, but it also ended up in Colossae as well. Philippians, you know, Galatians was to a group of churches in the area of Galatia. So it circulated. A lot of repetition. And even in the same book, in the very same letter, you'll find that Paul will talk about something and then you can move on, and a little bit later you go right back to that very same thing. And even here, as I mentioned, in chapter 4, particularly verse 7, and then on down to verse 16, talking about the very same thing. But now he's elaborating on it, as we noted, and he is trying from all these different angles to make it very understandable. As human beings, we're so different. One illustration would be very plain to you, and I might not get it at all, simply because of our backgrounds or of the way that we've been taught or not taught, our personal experiences. So it's almost as if Paul is using a shotgun, you know, with fine shot. It's going to be broadcasted. And one of them hopefully is going to hit what Paul is trying trying to get across. And so, yes, excellent point about the continued thought. And what better thought to elaborate on or to repeat than the resurrection and having that better body, that spiritual body in the resurrection. Good point. Anybody else? Okay, as he continued to look at this building that we have from God, being destroyed again, a building is more substantial than a tent. It's a permanent, solid structure compared to a fragile tent. If you've ever done any tent camping, you know that. It won't really keep out water. They'll sell it to you and say that it will. It can blow away in the wind. It's cold. But so Paul is using this idea to talk about this body that is from God in reference to the body that I guess in a sense we received from our parents. Fleshly body created or conceived in our mother's womb. We're flesh, but there is a permanent structure. And he tells us that this building is eternal. It's in the heavens, so it will never wear out. It really, I think, makes us realize that, as we get older, we can do everything that we know to do. We can, I remember Dolly Parton saying, anything that can be clipped or tucked or whatever, she said all these surgeries, make herself look better. You know what? She's still, she's right at 80, I think now. Didn't change a bit, did it? She might look just a little bit better, but she's gonna, wear out. She is wearing out, just like you and me. And we go to the doctor, we can take the vitamins, we can have the surgeries, but there comes a point when that isn't going to help, even if it helps at the time. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, Peter says that there's an inheritance, incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. And a part of that is the fact that we will have as it were, a heavenly body. In verse 2, for, again he uses that word, for in this we groan earnestly, desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. So again, he's talking about the fleshly body. He's talking about groaning within. And that, I think, is probably reference to the fact that we are longing for a heavenly body. I hope that all of us have that longing. And as we get older, that should get more so. It's not to say that, we are, praying to die today, although there might come a point when a person is so sick, a person is so unable to function, maybe that would be a part of our prayer. I think that we can see with Paul here that there truly was a groaning. There was a desire to move on where you don't have the arthritis, where you don't have the knees and the hips that don't work very well anymore. And so Paul has a desire, and that desire, he wanted, in one sense, to remain alive, but in another sense, he wanted to see the Lord come back so that he would be able to move on. Anybody with a thought?
One thing, the Lord has given us the Spirit as a guarantee.
Yes.
And we should all be assured that we're on the road to heaven.
Yes. And let's move on down there in verse 5. And by the way, you want to move on down, do that, because obviously we're not going to cover a lot of this. But he talks about in verse 5 that guarantee. And of course, we have the written word. We have the guidance of the Spirit. We have this assurance. And again, I think it's very important that, we don't have this worldly definition of faith. Faith is based on truth. And there is the faith, and there is a personal faith. And the faith is the Bible, the Word of God, the Old Testament, the New Testament. It is the truth. And as we study it, and we find that, it's free of mistakes, it's free of contradictions, written over a period of 1,600 of years by 40 plus writers, and there's a beautiful harmony from Genesis all the way through the Revelation. So there is a guarantee, there is an assurance of this. So again, it's not I hope, although that term is used, it is a hope that's based upon fact, based on truth. You remember, promises were made to Abraham in Genesis 12, and we find that it was hundreds of years later when his grandsons became those 12 tribes, and then there was that 400 years in Egyptian slavery, and then looking all the way hundreds of more years to the coming of Christ. But one of those promises was that Christ would come and salvation would be offered to the world. Abraham in 1 Corinthians 11, he had an assurance that they looked forward. It says, not having seen these things, but. So, how could Abraham be so sure? It was because, at least in part, God always kept His promises. And Abraham knew that. And Paul seems to be longing here that the Lord would come back right now. Of course, we know that hundreds of years past that. Is the Lord coming back? He is. And you and I can be confident. There's a lot of things in life, are if and maybe and hope so. But salvation and a home in heaven is not in that category. And Paul knew that. And he wanted these Corinthians to have this assurance. Why don't faint? Why keep on keeping on? It's because of what we're losing if we give up, if we fall short, if we quit. Anybody else out there?
Faith never outruns the evidence.
Good point, good point. Well, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, he talks about, faith there. And again, I think in our religious world, there are definitions of faith that they're just not biblical definitions. But yes, it's always based on evidence. It's always based on fact. It's always based upon truth. And for me to have faith, I have to have the foundation in the faith, what the Bible says. Peter says, be ready to give an answer to anyone that might question or ask about the hope that we have. Well, that doesn't mean that we'll always have all the answers, but all of us should grow and study the facts, the truth, so that, if somebody says, well, why do you go to church every Sunday? We should be able to give some reasons for that. Why do you believe in baptism for the remission of sins? Why do you take the Lord's Supper each week? Now, we won't always have all the answers, and sometimes when somebody asks you a question, that even though your brain is working, I'm really good at having an answer about 30 minutes later. You know, you ask me a question, you know, then I'll finally remember it. But there, as Clint says, it's based upon evidence. It's based upon truth. And Paul, he knew that this fleshly body was going to wear out, but that was not the concern, because he knew that he would have a spiritual body. And that's what he was longing for. It's what he was looking forward to. Anybody else?
Well, back in that time, they also had the book of Moses and everything, so he already had the truth. He needed to know that he was going to be okay. And plus, he had, when they restored his sight,
Yeah.
so he had it on personal proof as well when he was his sight restored.
You're exactly right. They had the Old Testament even then, and even though Paul was writing, a part of writing the New Testament, if you went back to the Old Testament scriptures, and you could look back at Adam and Eve, you could look back to Abraham, you could look back at Moses and see that God kept His promises, that there was something better, and you're exactly right. And then Paul particularly, you know, had the, as you point out, on the Damascus Road, he had actually talked to the Lord. Yeah, he had that. And because we can put our confidence in what Paul wrote, because Paul was being led by the Spirit, and that's what's called inspiration. It is God-breathed. And so it was written there for us, so that here this morning, you know, you and I can have that confidence as well. In 1 Corinthians 15, on down in verse 50, where Pat was talking about a minute ago, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It is a corruptible condition. But he also says that in the resurrection, the bodies of the dead, they're not going to be replaced in a sense, but they will be changed. And I think that's interesting, because he's getting in these next verses. Verse 3, if indeed having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. He's talking about the fact that this change is like a new suit or new clothing. And that is why in Matthew 17, in the Transfiguration, that Peter, James, and John, they recognized Jesus, of course, but they also recognized Elijah and Moses. And then in Luke chapter 16, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, these folks were recognizable. There is recognition in heaven. It will be this body in the sense of recognition, but it's going to be clothed with immorality. So no longer will it be flesh and blood, but this body raised, you know, from the grave with a immortal or a spiritual body. So Paul uses this expression of taking off one suit of clothing, flesh and blood, and putting on another. Interesting that, you know, the body in that sense, residing in the grave, it is the body that we buried. The spirit returns to God. But there will be a change, a reuniting in that sense, as the bodies will come forth from the grave, and that change will be made. So, again, no longer the weaknesses and the frailty of the flesh and blood, but a spiritual body. Anybody else? Yeah. Sermons talk about baptism, even in that change that has taken place, and maybe refer to the idea of putting off those garments of sin and putting on, the spiritual things. Again, in verse 5, the Holy Spirit who resides, in our hearts. You can go back to 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 22, serves as a guarantee or as a promise of our inheritance. And in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, we have that same idea there as well. In verses 6 through 8, so we are always confident, knowing that while we are home in the body, we are absent, from the Lord. So he talks about the fact that even though the Lord is with us in a spiritual sense, even this morning, he is here. There will be a sense in which we will actually be in His presence in heaven. And he uses the passage that we're probably all pretty familiar with. We walk by faith, or we live by faith and not by sight. But he says we are confident, yes, we'll yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and be present from the Lord. So, in a spiritual sense, we're with the Lord now, but in an actual sense, we'll be able to be in the very presence of the Lord, the very presence of God in heaven someday. So, we walk by faith. Anybody with thought? So faith is going to fade away, I guess, in a sense. We will be able to see clearly. And Paul wanted to go and be with Christ in His actual presence. And in Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, Paul did not long to die, or while he did not long to die, he recognized that to die is gain. And he sort of struggles with that idea. I appreciate your comments. I know there's so much more here, but hopefully that gives us an idea of what is taking place.